Many believe they understand how the Great Depression began. In their minds, one specific day comes to mind, October 29th, 1929, the day of the stock market crash. A wave of panic swept through Wall Street, and the American dream seemed to shatter in an instant. It's a convenient narrative with a clear villain, the reckless stock speculator, and an obvious point of no return, the ticker tape continuously reporting the disaster. However, this story has a serious flaw. It is not merely incomplete, but largely mistaken. The market crash of 1929 was not the cause of the Great Depression. It bears repeating, as this is a crucial point. The crash was a symptom. It was the jolt that rattled the windows, but the real destruction, the structural rot undermining the foundations of the global economy, had been accumulating for over a decade before the first stock fell. The true causes of the greatest economic calamity of modern times are a far darker, more complex, and more human story than the one we are usually told. It intertwines decisions made in the closed offices of Paris and Washington. The death of one banker whose absence decided the fate of nations. A gold fetish that choked the global monetary system. A trade war that turned allies into adversaries. And monstrous wealth inequality that placed the entire consumer economy on a trapdoor. The Great Depression was not an accident. It was constructed, step by step, by institutions and individuals who firmly believed they were right. What is most alarming is that many of these mistakes are being repeated today. So let's rewind time, not to 1929, but much further back, because the true roots of the Great Depression do not lie on Wall Street. They originate in the mud and trenches of the Western Front. When the guns of World War I finally fell silent in November 1918, Europe lay in ruins, a fractured continent. France had lost nearly 1.4 million soldiers. Britain had buried about 900,000. Germany's losses exceeded 2 million. The economic consequences were no less staggering. Bombing raids had reduced roads, bridges, railway lines, and factories across Belgium, northern France, and Eastern Europe to rubble. Old empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, were disintegrating. The financial system that had bound the industrial world for decades, the classical gold standard, was essentially frozen during the war as governments printed money to finance armies. And here we come to a critically important point that most historians, when discussing the Depression, simply overlook. The world economy before the war was remarkably unified. Capital flowed freely across borders. Trade proceeded with almost no barriers. Currencies pegged to gold created a kind of automatic balancing mechanism. When a country imported more than it exported, gold flowed out of it. This outflow reduced the domestic money supply, prices fell, exports became more competitive, and, eventually, gold returned. In theory, it looked elegant, and the system generally worked for decades. But the war destroyed this balance. The subsequent events were not a restoration of the old order, but a deeply flawed attempt to bring it back, an attempt that sowed the seeds of future catastrophe. Years later, Herbert Hoover would write in his memoirs that the main cause of the Great Depression was the War of 1914 to 1918. And while Hoover made many mistakes as president, on this issue he was arguably far more correct than he is usually given credit for. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposed punitive reparations on Germany. The sum of 132 billion gold marks demanded in reparations shocked everyone. Many economists, including John Maynard Keynes, warned that it was economically impossible to collect such money. However, for France, lying in ruins and burdened by its own debts to Britain and the U.S., these funds were a matter of survival. Britain itself, in turn, owed America enormous war loans, And the United States emerged from the war not only unscathed, but transformed into the world's largest creditor. Thus, a toxic financial system resembling blood circulation was formed. Germany had to pay reparations to France and Britain, and they in turn had to use part of that money to repay their debts to the United States. Its essence boiled down to a vicious circle. Germany paid reparations to France and Britain, who then used part of that money to repay their debts to the U.S., and the United States, possessing gold and powerful industry, would then lend funds back to Germany so it could continue its payments. This structure was a fragile and politically explosive closed loop. Its operation required the stability of each link. It would only take one country to falter, default, or cease lending, and the entire system would break down. Nevertheless, this is precisely what the victors decided to build. The reason was not economic calculation, but political expediency. American politicians could not forgive the Allies' debts, fearing the wrath of voters who would see it as a generous gift at their expense. French politicians could not refuse reparations, as their people demanded that Germany pay for the destruction. Thus, the world's greatest powers voluntarily locked themselves into a financial structure that initially resembled a house of cards. On top of this debt problem, there was also the issue of the gold standard. Before the war, most industrial nations pegged their currencies to gold. During the conflict, this peg was abandoned to print money for war needs. After the armistice, an almost religious conviction reigned among finance ministers and central bank governors. The world needed to return to gold. The gold standard symbolized stability, trust, and financial discipline. It was perceived as the foundation of all civilization. However, reviving the gold standard after the war proved far more difficult than simply maintaining it before. The war radically reshaped the world's reserves of the yellow metal. By the mid-1920s, the U.S. held almost 45% of all monetary gold on the planet. France, having stabilized its currency in 1926 at a deliberately undervalued rate, began accumulating gold at an astonishing pace. In just 5 years, from 1927 to 1932, its share of global reserves soared from 7% to 27%. Thus, the U.S. and France together controlled most of the world's gold, which put all other countries trying to adhere to the gold standard in a virtually impossible position. This is where the story takes a truly strange turn that most traditional interpretations of the Great Depression simply miss. Under the influence of the rigid orthodoxy of the gold standard, the Bank of France pursued a policy of sterilizing gold inflows. Simply put, this meant that France absorbed vast amounts of gold from around the world, but refused to proportionally increase its own money supply. According to the logic of the gold standard, an inflow of gold into a country should lead to the issuance of more money. This raises domestic prices, reduces export competitiveness, and ultimately reverses the gold flow. Such was the mechanism of self-regulation. But France broke the rules. It accumulated gold while severely restricting the money supply. The consequences were devastating. As economist Douglas Irwin argues in his NBER working paper, France, not the United States, was largely responsible for the global deflation of 1929 to 1933. His counterfactual modeling demonstrates that if central banks had maintained their gold reserve ratios at 1928 levels, global prices would not have catastrophically collapsed during this period, but would have even risen slightly. In other words, deflation was not an inevitable fate. It was a policy choice made by central bankers in Washington and Paris, clinging to an outdated monetary doctrine with almost religious fervor. France, however, was not alone in its adherence to austerity. It was joined by Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands, all members of what historians call the Gold Bloc, which pursued equally tight monetary policies. The gold standard, conceived as a stabilizing force, became what Keynes famously called a curse laid upon the economic life of the world. Instead of a safety net, it became a transmission belt, conveying economy-contracting shocks from one country to another in a relentless mechanical cascade. And if anyone could have stopped this cascade, or at least softened its blow, it was Benjamin Strong. His death in October 1928, just 12 months before the crash, may have been one of the key events leading to the Depression. From the founding of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1914, Strong was its governor, and, by any measure, the most influential central banker in the world, a strong-willed figure with deep connections in international finance. He maintained close working relationships with Bank of England Governor Montague Norman, and, perhaps better than anyone else on the planet, understood the fragility of the interwar monetary system. As economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz argued in their landmark work, A Monetary History of the United States, Strong's death fundamentally altered the balance of power within the Federal Reserve System, depriving it of effective leadership precisely when decisive action was most needed. While Strong was alive, the New York Fed remained the dominant force in American monetary policy. He insisted on coordination with European central banks, advocating open market operations as a tool for economic stabilization. In 1927, he lowered the Fed's discount rate to ease pressure on the Bank of England and prevent the international gold standard from collapsing. The decision to lower the rate was controversial, and critics like Herbert Hoover later accused him of fueling stock speculation. However, Strong believed that maintaining international monetary cooperation was more important than combating the excesses of Wall Street. With Strong's death, the balance of power within the Federal Reserve System shifted from the New York Bank to the Washington Board and regional reserve banks. Many of their new leaders were significantly less knowledgeable about international finance and adhered to a much stricter monetary orthodoxy. While decision-making was relatively centralized under Strong, it now became fragmented and indecisive. At the most critical moment, the Fed found itself paralyzed by internal disagreements. Economist Charles Kindleberger expressed an even more radical idea, stating that if Strong had not died in 1928, the Great Depression might have been avoided, or at least its scale would have been much less severe. While such a claim regarding a single individual is striking, it clearly shows how much the scale of the catastrophe depended on institutional failures and the lack of competent leadership at a crucial moment. Now, let's turn to the late 1920s, a period that, in popular consciousness, remained an era of roaring prosperity. And genuine prosperity in 1920s America did indeed exist. There was a rapid growth in industrial production. Everyday life was transformed by new consumer goods: automobiles, radios, refrigerators. The stock market was soaring. But beneath this brilliant facade, a structural problem lurked in the American economy that almost no one in power was willing to acknowledge. Prosperity was not shared. By 1929, the top 1% of American families received almost 24% of all pre-tax income. The top 0.1% earned roughly as much as the bottom 42% combined. At the same time, about 80% of American families had no savings at all. The wages of factory workers, miners, and farmers stagnated throughout the decade, while corporate profits and stock prices steadily rose. This was not just a moral problem, it was a structural economic time bomb. An industrial economy relies on consumption. People need to buy things: cars, clothes, appliances, food. When the vast majority of the population barely earns enough for basic needs, the economy becomes dangerously skewed. The few rich can only buy a limited number of refrigerators. They can only eat a limited number of dinners. Their consumption, however luxurious, cannot sustain an industrial economy designed to produce goods for millions. Economist John Kenneth Galbraith called this unequal distribution of income one of the 5 fundamental weaknesses of the American economy on the eve of the Depression. And he placed it first, not the stock market, not the banks, but the income gap. Because when an economy is structured so that most people cannot afford to buy what it produces, overproduction and underconsumption inevitably occur. Inventories pile up, factories cut production, workers lose hours, then lose their jobs. Spending falls even further, and the spiral feeds itself. The rich, for their part, did not spend their excess income on consumer goods. They invested it in financial speculation, in stocks, in real estate, in the very asset bubbles that were ultimately destined to burst. And many members of the American middle class, desperately trying to keep up with the image of prosperity they saw around them, borrowed to spend. In the 1920s, consumer lending experienced rapid growth. Installment plans became commonplace, and household debt continued to increase even after their incomes stopped growing. This picture will seem disturbingly familiar to anyone who lived through the Great Recession. Therefore, when the stock market began to collapse in the autumn of 1929, it did not fall into a void. Its fall occurred into an economy that was already cooling, weakened by inequality, burdened by debt, and suffocating in the grip of a monetary system that was draining liquidity from global finance. The crash was just the match, but the house was already soaked in gasoline. However, the crash itself was not supposed to be the end of the world. Stock market collapses had happened before. For example, the sharp panic of 1907 was stabilized with the personal involvement of J.P. Morgan. The severe recession of 1920 to 1921 was also overcome by the economy relatively quickly. The uniqueness of the 1929 crash was not in the collapse itself, but in the catastrophic political reaction that followed. When the banking system began to crack in the fall of 1930, and the first wave of bank failures swept across the country, the Federal Reserve System, by then leaderless and fractured after Strong's death, did virtually nothing. It did not inject liquidity into the system. It did not act as a lender of last resort, although, ironically, that is precisely what it was created for in 1913. Instead, the Fed stood by, watching bank after bank collapse, destroying the savings of millions of ordinary Americans and shrinking the money supply at an alarming rate. From 1929 to 1933, the money supply in the United States contracted by approximately 33%. 1 in 5 commercial banks closed permanently. Real incomes fell by 36%. And the Federal Reserve System, an institution specifically designed to prevent such catastrophes, only exacerbated the situation. In 1931, when the economy was already in freefall, the Fed raised the discount rate from 1.5% to 3.5%. In the midst of a deflationary collapse, it tightened monetary policy, protecting the gold standard and stopping the outflow of gold from the United States. That, it claimed, required the rate hike. Thus, the Fed prioritized the abstract gold parity of the dollar over the well-being of millions of Americans. At a conference honoring Milton Friedman in 2002, Ben Bernanke, the future head of the Federal Reserve System during the 2008 crisis, delivered a famous speech. Addressing Friedman, Bernanke said of the Great Depression, "You're right, we did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again. For a central bank, this was the highest possible institutional admission of guilt. However, the massive failures of the Fed still do not fully explain why the recession escalated into a decade-long global depression. To find that answer, we must turn to another catastrophic mistake, this time originating not in the central bank, but in the halls of Congress. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, signed by President Herbert Hoover in June 1930, raised duties on over 20,000 imported goods to record levels in U.S. history. The idea was to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition during a downturn. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition urging Hoover to veto it. He did not. The world's response was swift and harsh. The largest U.S. trading partner, Canada, immediately imposed retaliatory tariffs on 16 categories of American goods, representing about 30% of all American exports to that country. Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and dozens of other nations followed suit, erecting their own tariff barriers. Over 2 years, more than 20 nations imposed retaliatory trade restrictions. The bloodstream of the global economy, world trade, contracted by approximately 66% from 1929 to 1934. American industry suffered a devastating blow. U.S. exports to Europe plummeted from approximately $2.3 billion in 1929 to just $784 million in 1932. Imports from Europe fell even more sharply, from $1.3 billion to $390 million. For industries oriented towards foreign markets, such as agriculture and heavy industry, this tariff proved to be, remember that vicious circle we talked about? Germany borrowing from America to pay reparations to France and Britain, who in turn repay war debts to the U.S.? The Smoot-Hawley Act broke this cycle. Due to the tariffs, Germany lost the ability to sell goods to America and, consequently, to earn dollars to service its debts. And when American lending to Germany ceased, which had been declining since 1928 after the Fed raised interest rates, the entire reparations system collapsed. And so it did. In 1931, the largest Austrian bank, Credit Anstalt, went bankrupt. The crisis spread to Germany, engulfing it in a full-scale banking panic. Britain, unable to maintain the pound's exchange rate, abandoned the gold standard in September 1931. The dominoes continued to fall. Now, let's tie all the threads together. The true horror of the Great Depression lay not in a single cause, but in how multiple failures amplified each other, spiraling into a deadly vortex. No single policy measure could have stopped it. Before us is the unresolved legacy of World War I, a global debt structure inherently unstable and politically unreformable. Before us is the gold standard, rigidly imposed on a world that could no longer sustain it. Monetary gold accumulated in U.S. and French vaults, while the rest of the world suffocated without liquidity. Before us is the death of Benjamin Strong, which deprived the Federal Reserve System of its most capable leader precisely when leadership was most crucial. Before us is the Federal Reserve System itself, which, without Strong's guiding hand, pursued a catastrophically tight monetary policy. It allowed the money supply to collapse and refused to act as a lender of last resort as waves of bankruptcies rolled in one after another. Before us is monstrous income inequality, which undermined consumer demand and made the economy structurally vulnerable to any downturn. Before us are reckless financial speculations, fueled by cheap credit and weak regulation. They inflated asset bubbles that were destined to burst. And before us is the Smoot-Hawley Act, which destroyed international trade and cooperation at the very moment the world needed them most. Each of these factors individually would have caused a recession, but together they created a catastrophe that deprived hundreds of millions of people around the globe of their livelihoods. U.S. industrial output contracted by almost 47%. GDP fell by 30%. Unemployment surpassed the 20% mark, rising to 50% or more in some cities. People lost their homes, their savings, their self-respect. Middle-class individuals who had recently been on solid footing now lined up for free bread. And the tragedy is that almost all of this could have been avoided. There was no fatal necessity to tie the economy so rigidly to the gold standard. The Bank of France could have avoided accumulating gold reserves. The Federal Reserve System could have prevented bank failures. Congress should not have passed the Smoot-Hawley Act. Governments did not need to prioritize abstract loyalty to gold parity over the real well-being of their citizens. All these decisions were made by specific people and institutions, often guided by the best intentions. And it was these decisions that led to the largest economic catastrophe of modern times. The main mistake historians make again and again is reducing all this complexity to a simplistic scheme: a stock market crash followed by a depression. Such an explanation is not just incomplete, it is deceptive. It creates the impression that the depression was a natural disaster, an act of providence, something that befell the world suddenly and without warning. However, this is a misconception. It was created by human hands, the result of political failures at all levels. Central bankers worshipped the golden calf. Politicians chose protectionism over international cooperation. The financial system concentrated wealth in the pockets of an increasingly narrow circle of individuals. And institutions remained inactive precisely when their intervention could have fixed everything. And the more closely we look for similarities, the more unsettling the parallels with the present seem. Wealth is distributed more unevenly, politics are polarized, central banks struggle with the limitations of their own tools, and trade wars escalate into tariffs. The global financial system rests on colossal, possibly unsustainable debt. The international order seems to be cracking, giving way to nationalism and rivalry instead of cooperation. The world learned several harsh lessons from the Great Depression, lessons that led to the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, deposit insurance, and modern principles of central banking. But lessons tend to be forgotten. The generation that lived through the Depression, standing in breadlines, watching banks close and losing everything, is gone. And the institutional safeguards that generation created are now being questioned, weakened, or dismantled. The Great Depression was not a single cause event. It was a systemic collapse, a cascade of self-reinforcing errors and miscalculations that ultimately brought down the entire global economy. And the most dangerous myth of all is the belief that such a thing cannot happen again. There is another dimension to this story, one that is rarely discussed: the human cost hidden behind the dry figures. The phrase "unemployment reached 25% means approximately 13 million Americans without jobs and income, and often without any prospects. However, these numbers are silent about what it was like to live in such a reality. They don't tell the story of a father who left home every morning pretending to go to a non-existent job because he couldn't bring himself to tell his family the truth. Their footage did not capture children going to school hungry because of empty kitchens. They failed to capture the shame, despair, and the quiet destruction of human dignity that years of poverty brought to the richest country in the world. In the rural South and the Great Plains, the economic crisis coincided with an ecological disaster. The Dust Bowl, a decade-long ecological catastrophe caused by decades of intensive farming and prolonged drought turned millions of acres of once fertile land into a desert. Giant dust storms, some stretching for hundreds of miles, darkened the skies over cities, reaching as far east as New York and Washington. Hundreds of thousands of families, their land destroyed and livelihoods ruined, loaded their meager belongings into broken trucks and headed west to California. There they were met not with embraces, but with hostility, exploitation, and new hardships. The psychological damage was immense. In the early 1930s, suicide rates sharply increased. Malnutrition became widespread, especially among children. In some coal mining regions of Appalachia and industrial cities of the Midwest, living conditions approached those of third-world countries. People died not from exotic diseases, but from the simple and harsh consequences of poverty, from hunger, cold, and treatable illnesses whose cures they could no longer afford. This is what should keep us awake at night. The Depression destroyed not only wealth, it destroyed faith. Faith in institutions, faith in democracy, faith in the very idea that the system could work for the benefit of ordinary people. And into this vacuum of faith stepped some of the most dangerous political movements of the 20th century. In Germany, the devastation caused by the Depression accelerated the rise of the Nazi Party. In Italy, it strengthened Mussolini's power. In Japan, it bolstered the position of militarists who led the country down the path of imperial expansion in Asia. The path from the trading floors of Wall Street to the battlefields of World War II runs directly through the economic catastrophe of the 1930s. This connection is not accidental, it is causal. Political extremism is a direct consequence of economic despair. It arises when a person loses everything, when faith in the social contract collapses, and when the institutions meant to protect it clearly fail. In such a state, people become susceptible to demagogues offering simple solutions to complex problems. Blame foreigners, blame bankers, blame outsiders. The specific scapegoats vary from country to country and from era to era, but the underlying dynamic remains the same. That's why it's so important to understand the true causes of the Great Depression, not as a mere historical exercise, but as a warning. The forces that created it, extreme inequality, rigid monetary dogma, trade protectionism, institutional incompetence, international debt imbalances, political short-sightedness, are not relics of the past. They are present with us today, albeit in different forms and proportions, but still recognizable to anyone willing to look closely. The conventional version of the Great Depression's history is, in some ways, comforting. According to it, the market went crazy, a bubble burst, and everyone had a bad time for a while. It implies that the Depression was essentially an accident, an anomaly that we have since learned to prevent. However, the true story is far less comforting. It is that the Depression was caused by systemic failures of institutions created precisely to prevent such catastrophes. Central banks tightening policy when it should have been eased. Governments erecting barriers when cooperation was needed. Financial systems concentrating risk and wealth to dangerous limits. An international order that prioritized blind adherence to outdated rules over the well-being of hundreds of millions of people. And the most sobering lesson is this: almost everyone who made these catastrophic decisions was convinced they were right. Defenders of the gold standard in central banks believed they were maintaining financial discipline. Politicians who voted for the Smoot-Hawley Act believed they were protecting American workers. Federal Reserve officials who refused to intervene during banking panics believed they were allowing the market to naturally cleanse itself. These were not villains. These were people who made a mistake. And the difference between a recession and a depression between hardship and catastrophe was determined by one thing: whether those in power understood what was actually happening and had enough courage to act. This is the main lesson of the Great Depression, not that markets crash. They always have and always will. The lesson is that what happens next is most important. What those in power choose to do after a crisis, and whether they have the wisdom and will to deviate from orthodox views when those views are leading the world to the brink. So, the next time you're told that the Great Depression was caused by a stock market crash, you'll know the truth. You'll know that the crash was just the beginning. The moment when the failures accumulated over a decade finally became impossible to ignore. The true causes lay deeper, were older, and far more human than any stock market report can reflect. They were rooted in war, debt, gold, greed, fear, and the fatal assumption that the rules of the past were fit to govern the future. And these causes, in one form or another, are still with us. If this narrative has changed your perspective on economic history, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. We explore the underlying mechanisms behind the management of markets, states, and the global order. These are the stories that don't make the news, but subtly define the reality around you. Share in the comments what you consider the key cause of the Great Depression: the gold standard, Fed policy, or growing inequality. I'm genuinely interested in your opinion, and if you haven't liked it yet, please do. Your support directly helps the channel reach those who want to understand the true nature of money and power. See you in the next episode.